The Tsardom of Russia had a very effective alternative to pike and shot warfare. In 16th century Western Europe, pikemen defended musketeers and arquebusiers against attacks by cavalry and infantry. However, Russian armies never heavily relied on pikes. Instead, they used wandering towns, known as Guliai-Gorod, to protect their shot units. Guliai-Gorod were mobile field fortifications that provided cover for infantry and artillery, and prevented enemy cavalry from charging into the Russian ranks. These mobile fortresses proved particularly effective against the Tartar hordes that dominated the steppes in the south of the Tsardom, but were also effective against Western pike and shot tactics. In this video, we'll investigate the Eastern alternative to pike and shot warfare and examine how they were used in battle. This video is brought to you by Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. What makes Tacticus great is not just the Warhammer 40,000 setting, which I'm a fan of, but that it offers fast-paced, turn-based gameplay that does require thinking ahead and using strategy. It's not one of those games which plays itself. If you do not position your characters well enough, or if you don't have the right team comp, you're not going to succeed. Tacticus' gameplay cycle of unlocking progression and achievement is rewarding because it allows you to customize your forces and deploy increasingly powerful units with unique abilities, each with their own specific trait and strategy. Currently, there are more than 70 champions from 17 playable factions available. On top of the PvE campaigns such as the Fall of Cadia, there are also PvP live events and guild raids, and an ever-expanding roster of factions and champions. While you can play and enjoy Tacticus entirely for free, there are in-game paid unlocks available, which often come with a regular discount, and which I found can be worthwhile if you're wanting those later campaigns right from the get-go, or if you wish to play as a certain faction from the very beginning. Ready to take the battle to the Warhammer 40,000 universe? Use the QR code on screen or click the links below and join Tacticus today. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, warfare in Europe underwent a fundamental change, mainly due to the increased importance of firearms and artillery. In Western Europe, commanders increasingly replaced close combat units with arquebusiers and musketeers, until their armies consisted of solely pikemen and arquebusiers. These two units existed in symbiosis. The pikemen provided cover against charges, while the arquebusiers and musketeers kept the enemy at a distance and weakened them from afar. This symbiosis is known as pike and shot warfare. The shift to this new mode of fighting was primarily enabled by social, tactical and technological advances. In the late 16th century, new and better weapons, such as lighter muskets or better artillery, spread quickly in Western Europe. In the Tsardom of Russia, however, this took some time, especially in the remote southeastern regions. On the edges of the steppe, the home of the famous Cossacks, artillery only caught on when lighter field guns started to be produced more frequently around 1620. Until then, most of the firepower came from arquebuses and matchlocks. These weapons were cumbersome and somewhat imprecise, which is why armies were reluctant to deploy arquebusiers without cover. The problem was that the steppe was pretty much an open field, and hedges and ridges or fortifications were not readily available elsewhere either. Because of this, a reliable substitute was needed. A cover that was always available, regardless of location, according to the historian Brian Davies, an expert on Russian history. This was the Guliai-Gorod. Guliai-Gorod is actually an umbrella term for various mobile field fortifications. It is one of several words used by the Russian sources to designate defensive structures and can refer to various types. Guliai-Gorod can be roughly divided into three categories: large defensive walls permanently placed on a battlefield like mobile palisades, smaller defensive screens mounted on wagons, and finally wagon forts or tabors. Let's first examine the type that has fascinated historians and history buffs the most, yet was also the rarest: the large defensive wooden walls. In 1591, the Crimean Tatars invaded the Tsardom of Russia. They easily advanced to the empire's heart because the Russians were busy fighting the Swedes. To stop the Tatars and protect his capital, Tsar Fyodor I sent his brother-in-law, the later usurper Boris Godunov, to Moscow. While the Tatars crossed the Oka at Teshilov and approached the capital, Godunov had a 4 kilometers long Guliai-Gorod built south of the city between the two branches of the Moskva. The English diplomat Giles Fletcher, who was traveling through Russia at the time, describes this field fortification as a double wall, approximately 3 meters apart, made up of wooden panels and embrasures. These elements were transported on wagons and had small wheels or skids to push them together or apart. When they were in position, the 2.5 by 1.5 meters panels were connected with chains. This double wall ran along the entire front and the center of the army, but left enough space at the sides for the cavalry, which formed the wings to swarm out. Between the two walls were light field guns and arquebusiers. According to the historian Chester Dunning, this was the usual deployment when using a Guliai-Gorod like this. For the streltsy, the Russian firearm infantry, the position behind the protective walls was ideal, because they had heavy arquebuses that had to be placed on a support to fire. On the morning of the 13th of July, the Tatars attacked. When they charged the Guliai-Gorod, arquebuses and artillery welcomed them with a volley of lead. But despite heavy losses and repeated rapid attacks by the Russian cavalry against their flanks, they didn't give up. The battle raged back and forth all day, and the Tatars failed to break the Guliai-Gorod and eventually retreated. Fletcher hadn't expected anything else. He thought these field fortifications were particularly effective against the Tatars, quote, "that bringeth no ordnance nor other weapon into the field, save his sword, bow and arrows," end quote. Guliai-Gorod like this were relatively rare, because their large size made them difficult to move. Depending on the situation, the individual elements were arranged differently. One of the few contemporary depictions of a ring-shaped Guliai-Gorod shows the siege of Moscow in 1606. The Guliai-Gorod that can be seen here encloses a tent camp. Such massive wooden walls were ideal for defending a fixed position, such as a town, a hill or a river crossing. However, in the Tsardom of Russia, the next town was not often around the corner, especially in the vast territory around the Great Eastern Steppe, where cavalry reigned supreme. Less massive and more mobile alternatives were used. When the second false Dimitri and his allies from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth marched against Moscow in 1609 to seize the throne, he came up against a different kind of Guliai-Gorod. Tsar Vasily IV's troops awaited Dimitri's army on the Kodikna field, deployed around several Guliai-Gorods in which infantry and artillery were positioned. According to the Polish soldier Mykolai Marchocki, they consisted of table-sized oak planks mounted on wagons. These elements were each manned by 10 soldiers and firmly connected with chains to form a kind of fort. These Guliai-Gorod were much smaller and had the significant advantage of being movable by draft animals placed inside. In the battle on Kodikna field, they advanced slowly against the enemy. 3 squadrons of Cossacks in Dimitri's service attacked them but were driven back by heavy fire. Only when the winged hussars arrived did Dimitri's men succeed in separating the Russian cavalry from the mobile fortresses and capturing some of them. Vasily's troops escaped the disaster purely thanks to the rapid reaction of their cavalry, which immediately rallied and repulsed the Poles with a concentrated counterattack. A second mobile form of the Guliai-Gorod consisted of tree trunks laid crosswise like a log cabin, fitted with embrasures and pointed at the front. As they advanced, the infantry carried these wooden bastions and placed them in tactical positions. There, they provided cover for artillery and arquebusiers, and a safe retreat for cavalry and infantry. This second version had the advantage that it could be built on the spot using only trees. The historian Brian Davis assumes that most of the Guliai-Gorods deployed outside the core territory of the Tsardom were these lighter variants. However, there was an even more mobile and certainly more common alternative. Simple wagon formations had been used to protect camps ever since armies used wagons. In most cases, a wagon fort could achieve the tactical effect of a mobile Guliai-Gorod much more cheaply and efficiently. According to the historian Brian Davis, when sources use the term Guliai-Gorod, they often actually mean wagon forts or tabors. Mind you, we're not talking about simple wagon setups to protect a camp, but rather a sophisticated tactic that emerged in the 15th century. This specific form of wagon fort was pioneered by the Hussites, a Bohemian proto-Protestant movement in the 15th century. The Hussites' problem was that their armies consisted mainly of poorly trained soldiers who didn't stand a chance on the open field against the well-trained and heavily armed men-at-arms of their opponents. After a while, one of their leaders, Jan Žižka, came up with a solution to this problem. He combined reinforced wagons with mobile guns and arquebuses, creating tiny castles. This way, his men could bring their experience in defending cities to the field. In battle, the Hussites formed a circle or square with their wagons, chained them together and positioned crossbowmen, arquebusiers and melee fighters on them. When they had stopped the enemy charge, the rest of the army, waiting inside the wagon fort, launched a counterattack. This allowed the Hussites to defeat armies against which they would have no chance on the open field. In addition to the Hussites, the Ottomans also relied on a combination of fortified wagons and firearms from very early on. At the Battle of Kosovo in 1448, they successfully used an order of battle known as Tabur Cengi to defeat a Hungarian-led army under John Hunyadi. The Tabur Cengi consisted of a fortified line of wagons defended by artillery and janissaries with large muskets. It was flanked by cavalry, which tried to force the enemy to attack the center, where they inevitably ran into the fire of the janissaries. When the barrage of artillery and small firearms had weakened the enemy sufficiently, the janissaries advanced, firing in volleys by rotating their ranks. Finally, they charged forward to crush the enemy in melee. The Tabur Cengi proved its worth and became the Ottomans' standard formation. Today, most historians assume that these two forms of wagon forts and the mantelettes used by the archers in the Middle Ages inspired the Guliai-Gorod. The military successes of the Hussites and the Ottomans at the end of the 15th century proved the effectiveness of wagon forts. As a result, the tactics spread rapidly in Eastern Europe, including to Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Tsardom of Russia. Wagon forts could give an army a tactical advantage, allowing them to compensate for numerical inferiority by optimizing the effects of guns and arquebuses. In addition, it was much easier to coordinate troops inside a wagon fort than on the open field, especially if it was not very large. The tactics used with wagon forts were similar everywhere. Artillery and infantry, armed with firearms and polearms, defended the fort until an opportunity arose for the cavalry to lead a decisive counterattack. A perfect example of this is the Battle of Obertyn in 1531. In this battle, the Polish Grand Hetman Jan Amor Tarnowski defeated a numerically far superior Moldavian army by forming a square wagon fort at the edge of a forest. His infantry held this fort against several attacks by the Moldavians, while the cavalry weakened them with repeated attacks and finally put them to flight. Wagon forts were significant to the Tsardom of Russia, in particular because it bordered the Eurasian steppe. This seemingly endless grassland was sparsely populated, offering hardly any resources, and certainly no cover. Anyone who ventured there had to bring their own supplies and find a way to protect themselves against the local nomadic peoples, especially the Tatars. Because wagons are both a means of transport and a mobile cover, the wagon fort became a key tactical element in all Tsarist campaigns in this area in the late 16th and 17th centuries. It is no coincidence that Guliai-Gorod literally translates to wandering town. The wagon trains that large Russian armies brought with them were gigantic. For example, when Vasily Vasilievich Golitsyn marched against the Crimean Tatars in 1687, his army of around 90,000 Russian soldiers and 50,000 Cossacks formed a single enormous wagon fortress around 1.5 kilometers wide and 5 kilometers long. Although this formation slowed the army down considerably, it only covered around 10 kilometers a day. It ensured that it was always protected. If Tatars were spotted, the convoy immediately stopped and formed a wagon fort. Once the wagon fort was finished, the Tatars couldn't do much because they usually didn't have the means to break through. If they took a convoy by surprise, however, and the marching army did not have enough time to form a wagon fort, it often ended in disaster. A French military engineer who traveled through Eastern Europe in the 1630s wrote, quote, "In the field, I have myself observed units of at least 500 Tatars several times, who attacked us in our tabor. And even though I was accompanied by only 50 to 60 Cossacks, the Tatars could do us no harm. Nor could we harm them, since they kept beyond the range of our firearms." In his eyes, a wagon fort was the only way to safely cross the steppe between the Budjak horde and the Dnieper River. The Russian-Polish War of 1654 to 1667 showed that the wagon forts were effective against Central European armies too. In 1660, the Russian military commander Vasily Borisovich Sheremetev marched toward Krakow with almost 20,000 men and 3,000 wagons to crush the Polish army in a decisive battle. But as he passed the village of Libuar, he was surprised by the Polish commanders Stanisław Potocki and Jerzy Sebastian Lubomirski. Along with their allies, the Tatars, they smashed his vanguard on the spot, forcing him to dig in with the rest of his troops at the edge of a forest. The Russian forces held out despite their numerical inferiority, thanks to the quickly formed Wagon fort. Still, they were trapped, and the situation became increasingly precarious over the next 12 days. Potocki and Lubomirsky were sure of victory, but there was one problem they hadn't reckoned with. Vasily Sheremetev was a true badass. The Russian commander had a group of workers cut a path through the forest at night, and then made his way through the undergrowth. Although he lost a few wagons and some of his troops, he slipped through the cracks. Unfortunately though, the unsuitable terrain hindered his progress, and Potocki and Lubomirsky caught up with him just as his troops marched up a hill. They attacked from behind, capturing much of the Russian artillery. Yet again, the Wagon fort held, and Sheremetev got away. This campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of the Wagon fort, while also highlighting its most significant disadvantage. If the enemy had time, they could follow it and weaken it with targeted attacks on unfavorable terrain, and eventually wear it down. This is what happened to Sheremetev, but his story is not over yet. After the skirmish, he marched to Chutniv in present-day Ukraine. There, he confronted his pursuers. Making good use of their head start, his troops turned their Wagon fort into a real fortress, with bastions made of earth. When Potocki and Lubomirsky reached him, they had no choice but to lay siege to the fortress. They bombarded the Russian Wagon fort for almost 2 weeks until, you would not believe it, Sheremetev broke through the Polish siege line with a few wagons and got away again. This time, however, he did not get far. Heavy rain had softened the ground so that the Russian troops could only retreat to a reasonably dry spot at the edge of a forest. When the pursuers began another siege, even Sheremetev considered the situation hopeless and surrendered. At the end of the 17th century, Europe's gun foundries began producing better and lighter field guns. Against these new artillery, wooden walls and carriages offered only very limited protection. In addition, the Tsardom of Russia was growing rapidly, with its borders pushing ever closer to the Black Sea. Thanks to an extensive system of forward magazines and fortresses, its troops could now find shelter and supplies in the barren steppe. It was no longer worth lugging the cumbersome wagons with them. As a result, Guliai-Gorods and Wagon forts became less important, until they were finally replaced by smaller, more mobile field fortifications.